Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 17th of March 2014, Robert Skidelsky discussed how much is enough.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction. And first of all, I want to say that I'm very pleased to be here. Rather terrified of podcasts because all your ums and ahs are then recorded and they float away around the world and you kind of lose all control over them. But I'm very happy, nevertheless, for it to be done. I mean, how much enough was the question my son Edward and I asked in a book of that title. And one quick answer, which may be appropriate for this region, is not what most people in the northeast of England earn. Not enough. Just a few facts. Unemployment at 11.8% is the highest in Britain. That is unemployment in the northeast of England. And the employment rate at 58.7% is the lowest for the United Kingdom. So the northeast overall is one of the most deprived areas of the United Kingdom. All that is familiar to you, and as is the destruction of most of the manufacturing employment in the 1980s. My last statistic, which I find interesting, is that average house prices in the northeast as of January this year are 98,000, compared to 168,000 per house for the United Kingdom as a whole, and 409 for London. And London, that whole area of London, Oxford, Cambridge, a sort of triangle, and then the tail being Brighton, is just separated out from much of the rest of Britain. And I think if you live in London, in the southeast, you have a very imperfect idea of what's happening in much of the rest of the country. And I think that affects politics. I think the politicians are it's a London glasshouse, really. And all the discussions have reference to London. So I'll come back to inequality a little later, because I want to focus quite a lot about inequality and its causes in my talk. I think the interaction between consumerism, inequality, and hours of work does set us our main social problem for the future. And no political party is giving serious thought to the interaction of those three factors: consumerism, inequality, and amount of work. Let's start with hours worked, the hours worked. In our book, Edward and I asked the question, why do people in rich countries work so hard? Common sense and economic theory would suggest that the richer people are, the less they would want to work. And this has been the historical pattern, after all. The less work was what people looked forward to. Less work was what the rich did. And less work was what most people looked forward to. And certainly one of the demands of the trade unions was always for shorter hours. And therefore, the fact that over the last 30 or 40 years, hours of work have barely fallen, even though the country as a whole has got richer and people have got richer, is something to think about. And it was the first thing that struck us. It was the point of departure of our book, really. Why have hours of work fallen so much less than wealth has increased? And the main answer we gave in our book was consumerism. The richer people are, the more they want, we argued, and that counteracts the desire to work less, because in order to get more and more, you have to actually keep up your hours of work, even though productivity is improving. And our argument was that beyond the satisfaction of basic needs, wants are relative, not absolute. I mean, the needs are absolute, but then wants are relative, and the richer societies grow, the more important are the relative wants in our consumption basket. People consume in order to impress others, to keep up with them or run ahead of them. As Travis sang, the grass is always greener on the other side. And the most familiar example of the relativity of wants is, after all, conspicuous consumption, displaying one's wealth for others to admire. And it seemed to us that these types of wants are in principle insatiable. There's never enough, because you're always comparing yourself to someone else, and that comparison becomes global in the end as the reference groups expand. So our argument was that it's consumerism that keeps up the hours of work. It explains the fact that in 1930 we worked on average 50 hours a week. Today we work on average about 40, even though we're 5 times as rich as a society. So that was our argument, but there was a flaw in it, which we didn't spot. Hours of work had been falling steadily for about 100 years, from the late 1880s until about 1980. And then they stopped falling. They got stuck at this average of about 40 hours. And obviously something happened around that time, in the 1980s, which couldn't just be explained by consumerism. This brings us to a second factor, which is very, very important, and that is the growth of inequality. The statistics tell the story. A century ago, the richest 10% in Britain owned about 90% of the wealth of Britain. By the middle of the last century, this had fallen to 60%. So there was some compression of wealth in the middle years of the last century. Now it's back to 70%. Not 90%, but the trend is upwards. What you see is a U. And great inequality before 1914, then a decrease in inequality in the middle years, and since 1980, an increase again. And the national statistics of income are even more striking than those of wealth. In 1910, 47% of the national income went to the top 10% of the population. In 1970, this had fallen to 28%. Now it's back to 42%. So for both wealth and income, you do observe this pattern of huge inequality, then compression, and then the increase again. Now the compression, the move to greater equality in the period roughly 1920 to 1960, 1970, was the result of dramatic events. I mean, the 2 world wars destroyed a huge amount of capital, and that hit the rich. It was the result of the Great Depression. It was the result of social legislation. It was the result of the rise of the trade unions. All these things tended to make society less unequal. And then all those things have faded away, one by one. And so there's nothing really to stop any longer the natural inequality of a capitalist system from growing. I mean, there are no counterweights any longer, or the counterweights have been very much weakened. And, it's not just the top 10% that we're talking about. It's the top 1% and the top 0.1%. The top 1% have been racing ahead of the rich. as well as everyone else. That's to say, a very, very small number of people get a hugely disproportionate share of gains. The most graphic example of this is the way the pay of the chief executives of large companies and superstars in general. We live in a superstar culture. But let's take the chief executives of large companies. In 1965, they made 20 times as much as their employees, which some may regard as too much. But now they make 275 times more than their average employee, than their employees. That's all happened in the last 35 years. And it's easy to see that a highly unequal distribution of income translates very, very quickly into a highly unequal and growing distribution of wealth as income is leveraged into property and financial assets. So income, very unequal distribution of income leads to a very unequal and growing distribution of wealth. In other words, in emphasizing the importance of consumerism on hours of work, we failed to take sufficient account of the rise of inequality. And so most people in Britain don't go on working long hours, I think, because they're so greedy, but because they can't afford to give up work. They can't afford to work less. And the destruction of manufacturing has accentuated that, because a lot of people who lost jobs in manufacturing went on to less good jobs, lower paid jobs in the service sector, and in order to keep up, the standard of living that they, the society as a whole had achieved, they had to work longer and longer hours. So the paradox is that technical progress has opened the door to abundance for all. Advertising constantly inflames consumerism, but the way our system works has kept the door shut, the door of abundance for I think, at least half the population. Now here I want to illustrate a point which I found more and more important in thinking about things. I think in our book we were over-impressed by averages. Now, it's quite true that if we wanted less, we wouldn't have to work so hard. That's also true. So there is something in the consumerist argument. The two contrasting views of the good life go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, with the debate between the Stoics and the hedonists or Epicureans. I mean, when they debated the requirements of happiness, the Stoics said that happiness required escaping from the body and its needs. The fewer possessions one had, the happier one would be. Freer in the sense of not being enslaved by possessions. He who needs only a little does not have to work so hard, and all that is very, very true. And for the Stoics, the prescriptions for a happy life was to increase one's demands, not increase the supply of goods and services. For Plato, progress was to be found in non-consumption. Well, of course, that view has not, on the whole, won the debate over the centuries. And for the hedonists, happiness derived from the pleasures of the body and the senses. Pleasure was the sole ultimate object of natural desire. The more goods and services produced by the economy, the happier people would be. And I think that has been the dominant philosophy. That has been the dominant idea of progress. More and more goods and services, more and more consumption. Goods and services are a proxy for happiness. I am partly on the side of people. I'm not a Stoic. And I think anyway, any political party or movement that preached Stoicism today and advocated the practice of Diogenes, who just gave away all his possessions, including, in the end, his last jug, because he believed you could drink water just as well out of your hands. I mean, anyone who preached that would not get very far, despite all the valid arguments against consumerism in terms of ecology, the future of the planet, lots of valid arguments against the excesses of consumerism, and I completely concede those. But I wouldn't go all the way with the Stoics. So we're stuck with a consumer society. And the real problem is we need to moderate the pace of consumption rather than abolish consumption altogether, because it is a very important component of a good life. You've got to have enough, and you've got to have a comfortable enough if you're going to really take advantages of life in all its variety. But I would now say that if we want a future with less work, we need to act on both fronts, to curb both consumption and to reduce inequality. And there are policy proposals which you can make, which could be done, which would do both. Well, just very quickly, what did produce this shift in the 1980s, when the hours of work flattened and inequality grew and consumerism also seemed to take off? Well, first of all, I'll list them very, very quickly. The Reagan-Thatcher revolutions and the shift in ideas in favor of the free market. And if I had to single out one thing, I would say the weakening of trade unions removed one of the checks on the accumulation of wealth and the inequality of income. Secondly, the dominance of the ideology of consumerism. And I wouldn't repudiate what we said about that in our book, and particularly the connection between consumerism and relentless advertising. We live in an advertising culture, and we forget, not older people, but we forget how little advertising there was relatively about 30 or 40 years ago. Of course there was advertising, but TV was only on 6 hours a day. And most of it was public television. Commercial channel only started in 1965. So there was much less advertising, and therefore much less pressure to consume. And of course, what we've done much more in recent years is to equate self-expression with consumption. I shop, therefore I am. And your people's identities are bound up with consumption. But of course, there's also a lot of propaganda in favor of work. And this reflects the fact, which is very, very true, that work is less physically burdensome than it was. And in many cases, it's more fulfilling and more creative. But the propaganda for work goes far beyond this. Now, are we really to believe that the sandwiches we eat at Pret-a-Manger or Nero are lovingly and passionately made? Which is, of course, what they say on the sandwiches. And that this is a wonderful expression of the creative spirit of human beings. But there is that enormous propaganda in favor of work. The mission statements of companies now all stress the enormous satisfactions to be had for working for them, from working for them. In fact, it goes, what companies are designed, what they try to do now is to ensure that people look happy. Now, in a way, that's very important for a service economy. And therefore they smile enough. In Cathay Pacific, the cabin attendants are trained to smile. in the right amount and with sufficient frequency. And, you know, a sort of thin smile is not enough. It has to be very fulsome to give passengers the feeling that they're being very pampered. And, of course, if you see smiling, happy faces serving you, you assume that they're getting a lot of satisfaction out of their work. Well, that is not true. It's just not necessarily true at all. And in most cases, it isn't true. Most jobs still remain very routine. They're very programmed. And there's a complete disjoin between the outward expressions and the inner feelings about their job. A lot of it, of course, it explains a lot why daydreaming on jobs is so frequent. Their minds aren't there. And of course then, the companies get into trouble because these smiles, vacuous smiles, conceal the fact that they're not paying any attention to what they're doing. So anyway, the propaganda in favor of work is something that's spread enormously. And a factor which also operates to encourage both consumerism and inequality is globalization. Now, of course, what's been happening since the 1980s is that more and more jobs have been offshored because wages are cheaper. And that means that the replacement jobs have actually often been less good than the jobs that were being lost. I mean, I'm not saying that we've had a great rise in structural unemployment as a result of offshoring. We haven't yet got there, although I think we will if it continues at the rate it's been going on recently. But what we've got is creation of lots and lots and lots of jobs that aren't as good as the jobs that were being lost. And that increases inequality. And it also means that the people who benefit from this really are the owners and the managers, much less than the workers. Now, of course, we all benefit from globalization up to a point because we get a lot of our stuff cheaper, and that increases real wages. But against that, we've got to put the losses to the people, the producers, and many of them are worse off. And I think we also have to look at immigration. A lot of immigration does actually take jobs. Now, of course, it doesn't take them permanently, and we benefit in all kinds of ways from immigration. But nevertheless, it is part of globalization, and it is part of the growing inequality which we see in our societies. So these are issues which political parties are very reluctant to face. And a final factor is robots. Now, until recently, this was all the stuff of science fiction. And the robots are coming, and they're going to take over, and so on. But in fact, robotization has been leaping ahead and has been decimating jobs all over the place. Now, there's been a very interesting analysis of this in a recent book by economists Bryn Jolfson and Andrew McAfee. I don't know whether you've seen it. It's called The Second Machine Age. And what they do, their argument is, that what they show is that after the 1980s, the share of wages in national income fell. It had been more or less steady. Wages one side, capital the other. The share started to fall in the 1980s, and they attribute this to the accelerated technical change brought about by digital technology, information technology, and the speed up of technical change has benefited capital at the expense of labor. Their argument is very, very simple. Digital technology, they say, is doing for mental power what the steam engine did for muscular power. the huge increase in digital computing power has enabled robotics to penetrate deeply into the service and even the caring sectors, taking over jobs for which mental functions were previously deemed to be indispensable. And in other words, it's routinized it's enabled a whole lot of jobs to be simply programmed, prescripted. And that is the first stage towards abolishing the human beings doing them. At the moment, you ring up, you ring up a call center, you get a reply from someone, and you're subject to scripted, pre-recorded replies. In fact, one guy rang up, and he was rung up by someone trying to sell an insurance policy, a lady who introduced herself, I don't know, as Kathy Smith or whatever it is. And she said, would you like to buy this insurance policy? And then he asked some questions, and he noticed that the answers weren't exactly, in reply to the questions he was asking. They were sort of quite close. They were quite close, but they weren't quite there. And so he finally said, are you a robot? And she said, I'm human. And so after he had repeated the question, got the same reply, the phone went dead. And of course, she was a computer program. She was real, but it was a computer program that was answering or talking on the phone. And, what's happening then with robotics is that a whole lot of workers are being made redundant. For example, until fairly recently, Kodak employed 145,000 people and many more in its supply chain, and provided not only a mass of working class jobs, but a lot of middle class jobs for middle managers and skilled technicians. That is in 1965. In 2003, Kodak applied for bankruptcy. Instagram, the new face of digital photography, only had 13 employees when it was bought by Facebook in 2012. Of course, Facebook expanded and it does employ more people, but nothing like the number of people that were employed by Kodak. And you can run this throughout service economy. For example, Amazon, Walmart, what they do still is to have human conveyor belts that go from the warehouse, from the order to the warehouse, and then the packaging, right? So you still have lots of people employed by these big distribution and wholesale and retail companies, but they're shedding workers. They have human conveyor belts now, but why do you need humans? I mean, in the end, you can actually roboticize, or automate is the word, the whole lot. So these are all enormous downward pressures on earnings, and therefore explanations for the increase in inequality that has been so notable in the last 35 years. Not that people are getting greedier and greedier, although that is also happening, but also that society is getting more and more unequal. So, what do you want to do about it? Well, there are lots of ideas. One of the favorites, and of course I sympathize with it, is to improve human capital through education. This is favored by most economists, statesmen, and businessmen. And so the idea here is that you enable people to race with the machines rather than against them. And so you keep up with the increase in you keep up with the increase in computing power by increasing the power of your brain at the same speed. But it's a race. It's a race that we're bound to lose, actually, because increase in computing power is exponential, and our brains aren't going to keep up with that. So I think, I think a lot of the optimists take heart from the fact that they start with the defeat of the world chess champion, Garry Kasparov, by a computer in 1997. He lost to the IBM computer Deep Blue, and that seemed conclusive. Computers could now play chess better than the best human being. But it wasn't quite the end of the story, because when they then developed a competition which involved a computer on one side, the best computer on one side, and the best computer plus a human being on the other, the computer and the human being beat the computer alone. So human beings still add a bit of value. And that's comforting, but it's perhaps not quite as much comfort as one might hope. Now, another way of trying to keep humans in the frame of income earning is to reduce unemployment benefits, so as to keep the benefit level below the falling market-clearing wage level. You might say, of course, they can't do that. But that is actually policy. That is policy, aiming to give people a continuous incentive to work. For a time, at least, it may be possible to keep the price of human labor below the price of machine labor. But of course, you can't do that in the end. I mean, because wages can't fall below zero. They can't fall to zero even, but machines can. The cost of machines, once the installation has been done, you don't need to pay very much to keep the machines going. You don't need to give them food, you don't need to give them clothes, they don't need shelter. Well, they need a bit of food. I suppose you charge them up from time to time. But basically, that's not going to work. A very interesting idea, which is, I think maybe it's original to me, but that's why I say it's interesting. You could aim to slow down the computerization of work by taxing it. In other words, payroll taxes could be levied on both computers and human beings with a rebate for the employment of human beings. This all seems science fiction, but it's not. Is actually happening. Taxing computers, taxing the employment of computers might be one way of slowing it down. Another way of slowing it down is to have wage subsidies, subsidies on wages. We already do in the form of various types of in-work benefits and tax credits. So that's happening. An increasing proportion of jobs are being subsidized. They're not actually earning their value, so to speak, to the employer. Then you could raise minimum wage rates. Now that tackles inequality, but it doesn't tackle the long-term reduction of jobs, because obviously it's a tax on employment, and therefore it encourages workers to replace humans by machines. And then we come to our favored solution, and this is really, well, no, I have two favored solutions. One I've only just thought of recently, but the one in our book attacks both consumerism and inequality. I would want to make people's income less dependent on work. This is the idea behind giving everyone a basic income independent of the labor market in order to improve their work-leisure trade-off. And that was the central policy proposal of our book. And one way of doing this, there are many ways of doing this, giving people a citizen's income independent of the labor market. And one way of doing it is to get a wider distribution of capital assets through a national mutual fund, which provides a dividend stream to all citizens. And that fund could be capitalized through payroll taxes, inheritance taxes, gift taxes, and a progressive consumption tax. So it would hit excessive consumption, because it would, the more you spend on consumption, the higher the tax would grow. And it would also provide the funds for an income independent of the labour market. So I think these are the things we've got to think about seriously, and I don't mean in the next 50 years or 100 years, but in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And then a very interesting suggestion, I end on this, by the Fabian Society, is to make median income rather than average or per capita income the measure of economic success. In other words, to pay attention when we're thinking of how to make an economy grow to the growth of median income and not income per head. Because it's the divergence, as you see from the chart, the divergence between the two. So you don't necessarily want the top line growing at a slower rate, but you certainly want the lower line to keep up with it. And that does involve considerable redistribution. And no party on the left is prepared to talk about distribution any longer. They buy into the idea that everyone basically earns what they're worth, including the people who earn 250 times more than the average. And unless they make the argument for distribution, they're always going to be outgunned by the other side. So anyway, I'd like to leave these thoughts with you. Thank you.
Let's give me the machine from your pocket. Thank you very much.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.